Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, I'm pleased to present yet another installment in my series of Community Spotlight videos, in which I interview various prominent and upstanding members of our Conquest LCG community. Specifically, we discuss their favorite decks and how best to play some of their favorite warlords. Hopefully, through their sharing their personal experience, perspective, opinions, and advice, they'll be able to provide you with a host of information useful to both new and veteran players alike. Be sure to let me know what you think of this interview in the comments below, and as always, I'm ever open to constructive criticism. But with our introduction aside, let's get things started with a discussion of Torquemada Coteaz. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but before you help me try to figure out just how exactly to graft a second head onto this eagle I just picked up off Craigslist, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell our viewers just a little bit about how you contribute to the Conquest community.
Sure. My name's Paul Steiner. I am a Conquest player since it first started. I run the 40K Conquest database over on Blogspot. It's 40kconquest.blogspot.com. It's a community database that I encourage everybody to enter their games in, friendly, competitive, whatever. That just shows sort of a rough state of where the game's at. I run some various statistics on it. It's all open code. You can go in, see whatever it is you want, and hopefully it's a useful community resource.
Well, it definitely seems like a lot of people around the community appreciate it. You happen to mention that you've been playing Conquest from the beginning, but what was like the initial draw? What got you interested in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I'm a 40K player. I've been playing 40K since mid-90s sometime.
Sure.
Primarily I play Eldar or Space Marines. I've played cards a lot over the years, played a lot of different card systems. Haven't really played much in recent years. Mostly it's just been the Game of Thrones, where one of my friends had basically the entire collection and I didn't have to buy anything, so it was a nice, easy system that I could buy into for free. And great game. I really enjoyed it. But then when they announced that they were going into version 2.0, the local group basically died to nothing. Hopefully it'll be starting up again here in a couple weeks as 2.0 comes out, because I think Game of Thrones is a great game, but we didn't play it at all during that dead period. So, like I said, my group is primarily a 40K group. We had a lot of inherent interest in this game. Tried it out. I think it's one of the most balanced games I've played, and like I said, I've played many games over the last 20-some years.
Well, definitely. I suppose, what exactly got you interested in the whole data collection aspect? Because it's definitely, quite the database that you've put together.
That's I went to school for economics. I have a master's degree in it. I crunch numbers. I understand numbers. I enjoy playing around with them. Right now, I work for a group called the Michigan Nature Association. We buy protect land. I don't do a whole lot with numbers. I understand the finances and that sort of thing, but this is a chance for me just sort of to play around and do some very rudimentary coding and stuff that I don't necessarily do on a day-to-day basis, but I enjoy. So it's not a lot of work to put together.
Sure.
I find it sort of interesting, even if I would not use these results to make any sort of definitive statements by any means. As a numbers person, I know just how easily numbers can be manipulated, and Yeah.
Oh, sure, but it's nevertheless interesting to take a look at it, and despite, whatever flaws there are inherent to the system, there's
Oh, yeah.
also a number of huge benefits as well. Just the sheer volume of entries that you receive. Granted, some of them may or may not be accurate or skewed or whatever the case happens to be. Just the sheer number of entries is absolutely mind-boggling and hopefully serves to compensate for some of the statistical weirdness in and of itself. But I suppose, what was it about Conquest in particular that really made you stick with it, apart from the 40K theme and your history with a tabletop game? Were there any particular mechanics that really appealed to you?
Yeah, it's the competing in both a command phase and a combat phase really appeals. It's not straightforward. Magic the Gathering, you go through, you do damage, or you deck the person, or whatever it is. You have your one victory condition, and you just sort of drive towards that. This is a game where, and I'm going to contradict myself later, you really have to be competing in both the command and the combat phase
Sure.
in order to do well. And you have to balance those two. If you go all command or all combat, you're probably going to lose the game overall. So it's a real nice, interesting balance. To me, I think Conquest is probably the most player skill intensive game out of any card game that I've played, where it's not the decks that win games so much as it is the players. Now, decks help and definitely count for something, but a good player will beat a bad player almost all of the time, regardless of what the decks are. And that's not something you get in other games nearly to that degree.
Sure. I mean, just the amount of player choice that has to occur and the amount of information available coming into both players can be, at least as a relative novice myself, it can be absolutely overwhelming at times, like balancing playing events and detachments versus saving them for shields, the command phase versus the combat phase, the spatial component of where you want to commit your warlord, where you want to prepare units to be ready and unexhausted for subsequent turns. There's definitely a lot going on, so I certainly appreciate having folks like yourself on from the community that have got a little bit more experience under their belt, just because it can be an awful lot for someone relatively new to wrap their mind around at times. But, you know, in doing this series, I've been having people come on and pick a favorite warlord or favorite faction as the subject of their interview. And there's been a little bit of a community outcry for you to come on and represent the Astra Militarum, and specifically Torquemada Coteaz, as one of your personal favorite warlords and who they'd like to hear you talk about the most. But what is it that you find appealing about Kotz, and what makes him stand out among all our other options as a warlord that players might want to consider?
Yeah, so Eldrath was actually my primary warlord. I still enjoy Eldrath.
Sure.
I play Eldar on the tabletop, and he's the one that I have the most experience with. That being said, Coteaz is a very close second. Eldrath, I feel, has passed his prime a little bit. He really suffers with the amount of combat tricks new decks have come out with. So I was looking around, trying out different warlords, started playing with Coteaz when he first came out, and he was really weird. He felt extremely weak. I felt like I was losing every battle, every game. But then at the end of the game, I won. And that was very confusing, and it was worth further investigation. It was intriguing. Over time, I sort of continued to play with him and figured out a lot of those things. So now I feel much more comfortable knowing what he does, and in places where you feel like you're losing, understanding that you're really not. He doesn't do as much as other warlords, So that's, I think, where the feeling of being behind is. But what he does do, he's so extremely powerful at that he's able to get away with not being particularly good in command, at least the way I play him. There are other people that do play him command heavy, and he can. To me, I really think he needs to focus on what he does, and that is hit other people extremely hard and fast, and hopefully turn them into a bloody pulp at the end of the game.
Well, just because you mentioned your initial experience with Kotz was so kind of confusing and puzzling and off-putting, do you feel like anything changed by merit of like our card pool evolving, or was it just kind of an increased understanding of him over time more than anything else?
An increased understanding of him over time, primarily. I do run a couple cards of Emperor's Warrant, which came from the pack after him, but he came pretty late in the cycle, so his cards were in there.
Sure.
I think there might be a little bit of, there was definitely some tweaking. The initial deck is not the same deck that I play with now. Like I said, I stripped out a lot of my command. I don't run the traders or pirates or promotions or sanctioned psychers, which you think are pretty much standard cards, to really go for that combat, which he does well. That being said, one thing to note about Coteaz is because he does start with 8 resources and 8 cards, he's able to still participate in the command phase without spending too much in it. When the other person has all their cards on the table and you've barely started your deploy actions, you can counteract their command spending with less of your own. You may not win, but you can at least tie them up, and with Coteaz, that's pretty much all you need to do.
Well, I suppose what is it exactly that holds him back so much in regard to the command phase? Just his difficulty in like sniping enemy command units, or where does that weakness lie?
A couple things. One is, yeah, he can't snipe, so he's going to be going to his planets, but he also can't win at Planet 1 without investing heavily in combat. So his weakness in command comes from sort of the fact that he has to invest heavily in combat. He can afford to spend a couple resources, 3 or 4 maybe, or probably 2 or 3 on command, and then he's going to spend 2 or 3 of his opening resources on supports, and then 4 or so on combat. That's obviously totally made up and depends on your opening hand, but
Sure.
he needs to put a significant amount of resources at that first planet, because if they kill your units, no matter how bad your warlord is, your warlord will beat him in a one-on-one battle.
Right.
So he needs those combat supports to help him up, and cards like Rogue Traders or Sanctioned Psychers can't back him up. He can eat them once, but that's usually not good enough.
Well, I suppose before we just delve too much into the weaknesses of this warlord and put new players off of trying him entirely, you mentioned that he does combat well. I mean, what do you feel are some of his greatest strengths? Where do where does the enjoyment and power come from?
Yeah. So he has a very high ceiling, but also an extremely low basement. And if you make a bad decision, or God forbid 2 bad decisions in a game, you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
For me, that's something I really enjoy. I like being able to pilot something that has a big ceiling. And if I screw up and I lose the game. But it's on me. In terms of his strengths, he hits extremely hard. The hitting for 3 doesn't seem like a whole lot, but there are times where you have a preemptive barrage, his henchman unit untaps him. You're hitting for 14, 16 damage. Oh, that's probably a little high. 12 to 15 damage before they even get to strike. That's huge.
Sure.
And a lot of that comes through Coteaz himself as opposed to units, which makes him much more resilient to things like Archon's Terror or Plavex War Leaders, which are extremely popular right now because they're extremely good cards. You can't just chase them away. And that's something that doesn't seem like a huge thing, but in terms of actual gameplay, really is. He also has a lot of really good synergies in his deck. These aren't combos per se, and I get in little arguments with people in the Skype group occasionally about calling Cody as a combo warlord. He really, all of his cards have to interact, but there isn't that traditional, I draw these 4 cards and I win the game.
Right.
So you need to use the cards in conjunction with each other, and you need to use them properly, but it's not the traditional combo. It's a different way of looking at a combo deck, I suppose. And he has a lot of really great little tricks. Little things like his eagle that you pop off him during combat, and then you start off the next turn by returning him to your hand, and then you deploy him. You've just spent 2 deploy actions and 1 resource. You're going to see exactly what the other person has out and figure out what the best way to counter that is.
Sure, and like you mentioned, that sets you up perfectly to at least enter the command phase under favorable conditions, and I suppose the same thing goes with combat phase as well.
Right. Yeah, and also don't overlook his 8 health. That keeps him alive a lot longer than you think it would. The difference between 7 and 8 it's only 1, but it keeps you up. So
Sure. I mean, just like you said, there doesn't maybe at first seem like a big initial difference between a warlord that has 2 attack or a warlord with 3, but if you just break down the numbers, like the range of units that you threaten with a 1-hit kill to increase that pressure on your opponent to expend attachments and events as shields, I think the difference between, a unit that's killed with 2 or more attack versus 3 or more attack, at least within the core set, when I was doing my review videos, it jumps up like an additional 22 or 25% of every unit that you suddenly, threaten with killing in a single strike. So little differences like that definitely prove to be pretty significant. And just like you mentioned with the, inherent immunity to effects like Archon's Terror, I think it's really unique just in seeing so much possible firepower coming from a warlord, him or herself, as opposed to, say, someone like Nosdrag, where they're just beefing up the rest of the units. They're not so much the big hard hitter themselves. I suppose just because the Astra Militarum now has a couple different warlord options, I already know the answer, but I suppose I'll go through the motions of asking, but are you much of a fan of Colonel Staken? And if not, why?
yeah, no, I'm not. I don't think he's as bad as some think he is, but I know I'm really bad with him. He doesn't do it for me. 6 health for somebody that needs to be in a fight is bad. Zerathor has that same problem. But Zerathor can deal damage much faster through combat actions, whereas Staken is more limited to dealing damage 1 or 2 at a time.
Sure.
Overall, I've got a pretty good win rate at this game, but I think I've won something like 28% of my games with Staken. He's by far my worst warlord. So if you're looking for advice on Staken, I'm sure there's somebody else out there that can give you something, but I am not that person.
Yeah. I did recently do an interview with Tobin of the Traxxas Sector Warcast, who does count himself among the Straken fan base, but I certainly have to agree with you there that Colonel Straken faces a little bit of an uphill struggle. I mean, even just compared to someone like Zarather that can front load a lot of damage and benefit from his ability through playing multiple actions sometimes before combat even starts, and then he can hightail it out of there before being in much jeopardy himself. I think you put it perfectly when you said that, he has to persist, he has to sit there and allow his units to attack one after another in order to really get any kind of benefit from his ability. And seeing as how Coteaz can do much of his damage during the ranged skirmish, again, I feel that there's much more safety and really just power in being able to front load all of that benefit as opposed to really having to draw things out. I
But
suppose.
even if you don't front load it through preemptive barrage, the 8 health keeps you alive during those future rounds, whereas 8 versus 6 is pretty huge.
Oh, for sure. I suppose, are there any particular matchups you feel that Coteaz really excels, where, conditions look favorable for him going into the, just starting off the game?
I think that overall, Conquest is a pretty balanced game. I know there are some people out there who think that some warlords have like an 80% chance of winning versus others, and if you look at the database, it sort of implies that. To me, all of that's overrated, but I do think there are situations where Coteaz does have the advantage. The Space Marine matchups in particular, for me, have been very good. I think I've only lost to a Space Marine once, and that was when it was being piloted by an extremely good player, Kingsley. And that was a very close game. Indomitable is something that you're worried about because you do tend to hit pretty hard with some pretty big attacks. But that's one card. You don't need to worry about their tactical squads because almost everything of yours has 2 health.
Sure.
In general, I found those to be strong matchups, and the database seems to imply that other people find that to be good matchups as well. The Dark Elder matchup is better than a lot, where, as I said, the decreased usefulness of Terror and Clavex are things that Dark Elder don't really have to worry about. Those are great cards versus every other deck. Against Coteaz, Terror is still good, but you often have to play Terror to terrorize a unit that's exhausted and is just going to be sitting there.
Right.
So that Coteaz doesn't eat him. And that's not the ideal use for it. So it's not a bad card versus Coteaz, but it's not nearly as good. However, that being said, when Kith gets her den out early on and can run her chimeras around, that is trouble because Coteaz does not have effective swarm removal. And if Kith can deploy not far away from Planet 1 and you can't hunt her down, that's trouble. Unless you get the black ship, which then lets you meet her swarm 1 for 1. And that is one of the things I do like about Coteaz. He does provide some variety in play where if he gets his black ship early on, he becomes a very swarmy warlord. If he doesn't, he only has a few units out there because he's constantly chewing them up himself as opposed to getting them killed by the opponent.
Sure. Well,
and basically any warlord out there that wants to fight. So the Nazdrags, the Zogwarts, all of those, the Strakens are good matchups for him. Because if I can bloody you, I don't care how many units you have. If your warlord gets turned into a bloody pulp, I win the game. And that's good enough for me. Zarather is the one really weird one there. As we've talked about, his accelerated damage, despite being squishy, is bad for Coteaz. If you can kill my units before I can eat them, and before they attack, I'm in trouble. And Temptation is also strong because Coteaz does tend to play a lot of Slaanesh Temptation. because Coteaz does want to play a lot of units, and he does not want to be committed to a planet that's not Planet 1.
Right. Well, this came to mind when you mentioned, having maybe a little bit of a favorable matchup against some of the Space Marine warlords, but does it seem to provide much of a benefit in that you're rewarded so much for sacrificing some of your units? Like, I'm thinking specifically, sacrifice doesn't count as destroy, so you might be starving like a Captain Cato Sicarius of a lot of opportunities to generate additional resources, or for a Shrine of Warp Flame to bounce a Tzeentch card back to someone's hand. Does it seem like, throwing some of your weakest units under the bus provides kind of a benefit in and of itself?
Yeah, less so in the two situations you mentioned. With Cato can't stand up to Coteaz most of the time. If he has an Iron Halo and a couple Indomitables in hand, sure he can, but most of the time he's going to want to be off command sniping, so he's not going to get a whole lot of resources from Coteaz per se. With Zerathur, once again, he's going to do most of his damage before Coteaz can really eat. The one time, though, where Coteaz really shines in terms of the ability to sacrifice as opposed to just have things die is when Taurus is in play. I think it's Taurus, the planet that lets you get extra cards or resources if you control fewer units. There have been many, many times where my poor rattling sniper got eaten, even though there were no enemy units at the planet across from me, just so that I would either A, drop underneath the number of opposing units,
Sure.
or B, drop my number of units to equal his and prevent them from triggering that planet. So you can't sacrifice guys more than once per attack, but you don't actually have to be able to attack in order to sacrifice guys, and that's something that's worth being aware of.
Definitely. And I suppose you mentioned there are, a kind of a number of different play styles that Kotz might be kind of lend himself to, based in part on what you draw. But when it comes to deck building for Kotz, the Astra Militarum has a couple different ally options. They've got Space Marines, they have Orcs. What is your preference nowadays?
Yeah, I tried Space Marines for a couple games. The tactical squad seemed like it would be a potentially useful thing. It's fairly cheap, it's eatable, and it does give you some protection against the swarms that Coteaz can have trouble with.
Sure.
That being said, I think Orcs are the way to go. Orcs have the hitting power. They combine very nicely with Staging Ground, which I think is a huge card for them. You drop a Thug or you drop a Biker out, and you'll scare that Warlord away from the planet that he's sniping at. You'll probably get yourself an extra combat resolution that you wouldn't get normally. Ammo Depot, I think, is a card that you can include. I think I include one of them at this point. Coteaz uses a lot of supports. Kadishan Outpost is huge for him. Staging Ground is huge for him. I usually mulligan if I don't get one or the other of those. His Black Ship is a great card. So you can easily run 10 supports with him if you're not paying too much attention. The Rock Creek Bunker is pretty good with him as well. Ammo Depot fits in there. It's useful. It's probably not a 3 of. Orc Cannon, again, I think works very nicely with him because he can absorb damage or he can put damage on some unit that he's about to eat.
Right.
But you have to find a slot for it, and I don't think it's as good as those other cards I just mentioned. Squig Bomb is also a card in there that I think Orcs can give that's very useful to Coteaz. As I've been thinking about it, I'm probably going to start trying to slide it in just to get rid of the opposing dens, and there are those other the orbital cities that are its useful verse. One card that really seems like it should work from Orcs, but I've had no success with is Knotling Attack, which is sort of surprising, but there are just too many there's too much AoE out there, whether it's Plague Beasts or Tactical Squads. People are too scared of Dark Elder, and rightfully so, that just throwing in a bunch of 1/1 creatures doesn't really do a whole lot for you at this point.
Sure. Well, it's, I suppose you happen to mention Catachan Outpost, and that works in, a myriad different situations, but how typically do you find yourself using that in a Kotaz deck? Like, I could envision Rattling Deadeye, of course, for some extra range damage. The same thing with Preemptive Barrage. Is it maybe to help him snipe off command units, or do you have like a go-to means of using that support?
No, I don't really. The thing with Coteaz is you really have to be flexible with him. It's like I said, he punishes you extremely hard if you make a mistake, and if you make essentially predetermined decisions, you're probably going to run into mistakes.
Sure.
There are warlords where you can get away with that. Coteaz is not one of them. One thing though that is pretty much a predetermined decision is if you're playing somebody who has the potential to have Archon's Terror in there, you use the outpost on Coteaz, and you pump him up so that he can't be terrored away.
Right.
Other than that, yeah, throwing it on snipers, throwing it on any other unit just to make them hit a little bit harder is very powerful. Keeping in mind the shield situation and trying to make sure that things die. You often have to overhit with your units to really ensure that they die because you don't have Armor Bane or Warp Storms or other direct damage options.
Definitely. I suppose we've kind of touched on, some additional areas of weakness or vulnerability, and you just touched on one that you don't, have maybe quite the same combat tricks as several other factions do, but are there any other significant areas of weakness that players should be aware of to look out for? I know you mentioned like the command phase, but
yeah. So just one thing, if I might have misspoke myself a little bit. The Coteaz has a lot of combat tricks. He's not just a straightforward warlord, and his tricks may not be as showy, other than Preemptive Barrage. Preemptive Barrage is about as showy as you can get when you combine him with henchmen and you're hitting for 5, 6 attacks, or not. That requires, you can hit with 5 attacks, 3 of which are hitting for 3, and then a couple of them are henchmen. That is showy, but the rest of his tricks are more traditional, more shown. They're not the surprise tricks that other factions do have. But Coteaz's main weakness really is the one that I've touched upon a couple times, and that is if you make a mistake, you're in trouble. It's the old computer tech acronym of problem exists between computer and keyboard, or between chair and keyboard. Here, the problem exists between the chair and the deck. If you make a mistake, the deck, the build, the inherent setup of him makes it much harder for you to come back. Now, one of the things I like about Conquest in general is it does have a lot of ebb and flow. So it's not just steamrolling people.
Right.
But it doesn't have that same resiliency that a lot of other decks do. So that's something you have to be aware of, and you have to play a lot of games with them to really learn what your play mistakes are. And you're going to take some losses early on, probably. Play through them, learn from them, and you'll be much better. But you just need to really be careful of making the right decision and not taking things for granted. You can go up and play against Nazdrag or somebody who's a pretty awful matchup, and if you make mistakes, you will lose the game. So you can't get cocky with him. That was actually a problem I encountered. Is I was on this something like a 20-game win streak, and I got cocky against a Bearither deck that I didn't like the build, but I let my guard down, and pretty soon I was the one that was bloody, and he was the one with the win at the end of the game. So pay attention.
Right.
The other weaknesses are very sort of hard to tell. We touched upon Zarather. We touched upon the swarm aspects, unless he gets the black ship out. Nullify is a problem if you are going to rely on the preemptive barrage. Actually, opposing preemptive barrages are a problem as well, because it's going to be Coteaz or Staken that's playing it, and it allows them to retreat, which was something that I had happen to me once and took me by surprise. His other big problem, and this is sort of the hardest one to control, is Coteaz wants the game over quickly. That's why he doesn't like Warlords that can run away. So if you get a bad planet layout where it's just not possible to win the game early on, that's going to make the game harder for you. It doesn't make it impossible by any means, but it makes it harder. Coteaz wants the game over by turn 5, which, fortunately, one of the things we track over at the database is how long games take. It sort of surprises me, but 75% of the games are done by turn 5. 50% of the games are done by turn 4. That's consistent with my play experience, but it's a 7-turn game that you think games would last longer. They really tend not to. So, but if you are in a situation where where the opposing warlord can draw the game out, that's not good for you, because his units will be better than yours overall. You've got combat prowess, but that combat prowess is going to cost you units. You're going to lose the attrition game in the long run.
Well, I suppose just kind of still on that topic of weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and you happen to mention struggling during longer games. You also happen to mention some of the semi-unique advantages that Kotz has, like the suffering less from Archon's Terror, Klavek's War Leader. Do you feel like there are any specific cards or warlords? Zarather seems like a bit of a mixed bag, but is there anything that really causes you a hell of a lot of trouble in either the early game or the late game? Anything that you just despise seeing hit the tabletop?
No, that's the... I feel Coteaz can match up with anybody. He has harder matchups, and he has easier matchups, but he can match up with anybody. Eldrath, for example, has a number of advantages over him. The Nullify, the Eldrath is extremely hard to bloody, because he's a 1/7. He runs away and he doesn't care. He did his job by coming in and exhausting you.
Sure.
Kith with the Den is trouble, but there's nobody that there's no auto losses. There are very few auto losses in the game, if any. So, no, I don't mind seeing anybody, whoever sits down across from the table, I feel Coteaz can match up reasonably well with. And that's one of the things I do like about him.
Sure, well, I mean, even something like the Gleeful Plague Beast, Kotez's henchmen have built-in 3 hit points. If his eagle is protected from, being obliterated just because it happens to be an attachment at the beginning of combat, that works well. Also, guardsman tokens are 1/2s to start, so I can definitely see that being a little bit of a strength, and then just his flexibility in being able to sacrifice units as need be instead of just letting them be destroyed. It definitely seems like there's a quite a bit of durability and flexibility built in there. I suppose apart from some of the things you've already mentioned, like trying to end the game relatively early when you can, kind of, leveraging the deployment phase to your advantage as much as possible in potentially being able to starve your opponent of actions. Are there any other basic strategy tips or keys to playing a successful game as Kotez that you may not have realized at first, since he's a little bit trickier than some to pilot?
Yeah, I think the number one thing about him that for me was really a eye-opener, and I wrote a sort of silly little article over on Card Game DB called "The Command Phase is Killing the Game." Clearly, that was a hyperbole. It was an overstatement because the command phase is a very necessary part of the game. It's, as I said, it's part of the game that I really love. But Coteaz really brings into focus just how much of a balance you have to play between playing command and playing combat. And if you go too heavy with Coteaz and command, in my opinion, you don't have enough combat, and then a lot of your good matchups become bad matchups. So the key for me with Coteaz, even more so than others, is focus on your victory conditions. The game has 3 victory conditions. Decking the other person, which I've seen happen 2 times. Once was because we got a rule wrong, and once that it actually happened. So that doesn't count.
Right.
And then you either destroy the opposing warlord, or you capture 3 planets with the same icon. If you do those, you focus on those things, and that's what you do with Coteaz, you're in good shape. If you start trying to get tricky and winning more commands and drawing more cards, which, yes, they help you win planets and bloody warlords, but they don't do it themselves. And it takes so little to drop you below the curve in terms of your combat ability that that's something you really need to be careful of. Now, winning command, don't get me wrong, is absolutely important and vital. You just you have to do it smartly. You have to do it where it counts. Winning command on resource-heavy planets when you have a staging ground is important because you don't want to be going into the command phase having to save your resources. You want to be spending your resources during deployment, replenishing them during command, and then playing them again during combat.
Right.
Otherwise, staging ground is just a bad deploy action that doesn't give you any command presence.
Well, and kind of like you mentioned earlier, not getting cocky or greedy. So it seems like kind of keeping your eye on the ultimate goal as opposed to getting bogged down with maybe trying to stretch yourself a little too thin during the command phase just to win, cards and resources that at times could prove to be excessive if you just focus more of your, I suppose, resources in the sense of the things you have at your disposal. So like your cards and resources, if you focus more on actually winning the game as opposed to a bunch of extraneous stuff, you might ultimately do a little bit better than getting lost in things that don't ultimately matter, if that made any sense at all.
Yeah, no, it's the taking advantage of his extra deploy actions, his extra resources to start, and bullying that advantage. It's only 1 card and 1 resource, but it gives you the extra action, so it lets you use those things much more effectively, where you need to really make that advantage last as long as you can in the game. And if you're getting the cards and the resources from planets late in the game where they may or may not have an impact, but you're losing the early planets, that's 9 times out of 10 going to be a bad trade-off for Coteaz.
Right. Well, you've certainly touched on some here and there throughout this video, but what are some of your just favorite staple cards in either a combat or command sense? What are some of your go-tos? And at least for you, what are some of your auto inclusions when it comes to building a competitive Kotez deck?
Yeah, so my Coteaz deck is pretty well set. You can go view it on Card Game DB. It's posted there for everyone to see. So there's not much that I change in there, but he has some great combat cards. Preemptive Barrage is huge. Two Arms is a surprisingly useful card, whether it's readying a Catachan outpost or letting you use your black ship twice, or just being two shields. That's great. His combat units are good. They're not great, but they're good. The henchmen don't hit for a lot, but they let him untap and hit for another 3 without having to wait for a new combat round.
Right.
Do that during a preemptive barrage, and you're hitting for 6 without waiting for the opponent to strike. Thugs and bikers that you can drop pod in are excellent values. The assault team is very good because your units will be dying. Even if it's you killing them, you can still trigger the assault team. The Catachan outpost helps turn your combats. The Eagle is surprisingly good at combat, where he drops off, he hits for that one last point that gets past the opponent's last shield, and then he returns to your hand to be used as a 3 shield to save you from whatever just got drop potted in, or the Clavix War Leader that comes in trying to bloody Coteaz.
Right.
In command, like I said, I don't run a whole lot. I run Iron Guard recruits as my only 2 hammer guys. Battling snipers, raiders can hold planets, can test them as well. But they also serve good combat. And if you don't serve combat for me, you don't make the deck. Sanctioned Psychers are probably as good a card as Iron Guard recruits. The 0 attack takes them out for me. I admit I'm considering putting them back in because it does give you more resiliency versus things like Plague Beasts, and you can outpost them if you need to.
Sure.
But I don't run a whole lot of command. This is the only deck where I don't run promotions. So.
Well, I suppose just in, the experiences you've had playing Kotez, what are some of your, memories that really stand out where situations happen to come together and everything's just kind of worked out in a really favorable, if not perfect sense? Like, what are some of those Paragon gameplay experiences you've had where you've drawn all your combo pieces, even though Kotez isn't necessarily a combo warlord, but everything's come together really favorably. Like, what stands out in your mind?
Yeah, so I'm a horrible interview for this type of question because I've trained myself over many years. I was a collegiate fencer, so I have a varsity degree or varsity letter from MSU, and I've fenced at a fairly high level. And one of the very important things for me personally, and some people don't do this, but for me it was, as soon as it's over, forget about it and move on.
Sure.
So I don't remember things. I fenced competitively for 15 years. I can remember like 5 or 6 bouts. I did a whole lot more than that. I played a lot of games with Cody. I don't remember a whole lot. That being said, there are a couple that conveniently I wrote down either on the Skype group or Card Game DB, just to tell a little story, because I do enjoy stories. And when I knew you were going to ask this, I was able to go through and dig them out.
Sure.
And they're fun little stories. So one was one that actually happened just a couple days ago. I don't remember who it was because I don't remember these things, but I was playing a Zogwart player. My opening hand is bad. There's very little good in there. I mulligan and I get a hand that's equally bad. So the only thing I really have out is a staging ground and I think an Iron Guard recruit at an off planet to contest him.
Okay.
I commit Coteaz to planet 1 all by himself. My goal is to hurt Zogwart, who I was pretty sure was going to be going to 1, and that's it. I wouldn't bloody him. It'd take an absolute miracle to do that. If he doesn't send Coteaz there, all he has is like a thug, I think. So I would be able to win that because I can staging ground in a Engine Seer Augur.
Okay.
We go through. I have a preemptive barrage. I drop the Engine Seer through staging ground, play preemptive barrage, swing at Zogwart for 2. He doesn't shield. Sack the Engine Seer to Coteaz. Use the Engine Seer search. Find a cache and outpost. Throw the outpost into play. Use the outpost to pump Coteaz. Swing at Coteaz for 5 at Zogwart. And lo and behold, he has no shields.
Sure.
So he turns into a bloody mess. Coteaz gets hit for 3, I think, because I think it was a thug. I lose the planet, but the game's over at that point.
Right.
Zogwart needs his tokens, and if he's not getting them, then that's a very good thing. Now, it still took me till like planet 5 or 6 because my opening hand was bad, so I didn't have the units. We were sort of trading planets throughout those times, and since Zogwart wasn't trading tokens, he had no incentive to come after me at planet 1.
Sure.
But eventually, the number of planets got smaller, and Zogwart had to commit to the same planet as Coteaz, and that didn't last long for him.
Right.
There was another game where I don't remember exactly all the details, but it was a game versus Eldrath. I was in bad shape. I think it was a game-winning planet for Eldrath. Coteaz had nothing with him. He had a wounded thug. There were 5 or 6 good Eldar units, a couple Wraith Guard, probably a Council, probably a Warlock Destructor in there. That's not good. The advantage I had was I did have my supports out. I had a couple cache and outposts, a staging depot, a black ship, and I had a pretty good hand. Where after playing 2 arms and staging in henchmen, sacking those things, sacking the thug, using black ship using black ship twice because of 2 arms, using 3 cache and outposts, and dropping into assault teams. Coteaz and his 1 exhausted thug wiped out all that opposing stuff.
Dear God.
Yeah, it was a lot, but it shows that supports are extremely good in this game. They're also extremely bad, but when you're able to use them, they have some of the best effects in the game. And Coteaz is able to use them more than just about everybody else. The other thing that I sort of remember, because I try to keep track of it, is, like we said, preemptive barrages can get silly. They do huge amounts of damage. So I try to keep track of how much damage, the max damage I've done to an opponent. I'm pretty sure the record at this point is 23 points of damage before the opponent gets to strike.
That strikes me as statistically significant, you could say.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was overkill. But you know what? It's fun. So
Definitely. And I think just having the potential for things like that is absolutely enormous. But, even with these couple of exciting gameplay experiences you've related, it definitely seems like, although that may not be the norm, it is exciting that is nevertheless the potential. And just in getting so much benefit from supports, because there are a number of inherent risks associated with those, I think that really underlines just, how much you've been stressing that making mistakes with Coteaz can be very punishing indeed, just because I could easily see over-investing in supports doing a player much more harm than good over the course of the game. So it just seems like so many different factors you need to balance when you're playing this Warlord. I suppose something I was kind of wondering about as our video here draws slowly but surely toward a close, for players that are running up against our second Astra Militarum Warlord, what are some good suggestions or advice for doing well against Coteaz? What are some ways they might attempt to beat him?
Yeah, so just like Coteaz requires a lot of options in how to play, it requires a lot of variability in how the best way to beat him is. He doesn't have one big weakness. Like I said, swarms are a weakness, but if he gets flagship, he has an answer to them. He has answers to just about everything. It's how good the answer is. That's always the question. And
Sure.
so there isn't a do this and you win. There are things that Coteaz has weaknesses that we've talked about, doing early damage. One thing that we haven't talked about is hit points. If you have a lot of hit points, that's bad for me. Whether it's things like plague beasts that require me to hit you for a ton, or orcs in general that you have thugs that get bigger. You have those guys whose name I can't remember, the 05s that
The
just get.
Enraged Orc.
Thank you, Enraged Orc. I wanted to call it the Knob, but I knew it wasn't the Knob. So, no, the Enraged Orc, which I think is a great card. If you make me do a lot of damage, also you can have small number of hit points. You can have 6. If you have 6 Chimeras out there, that's only 6 hit points, but I don't have the number of attacks to go after that, and I don't have the AoE to do that either.
Sure.
So if you can attrition me down, that is good. Now, there are times where you'll want to attrition my units, and there are times where you'll want to attrition my Warlord, and that really depends on the game. But if you're able to get into a situation where you're doing damage to me and you're surviving my attacks, be it through good shields or having lots of hit points, that's trouble, because I want you dead as soon as I can, because I can't afford letting you get off a lot of hits on me. Like we talked about, delaying the game. The more you can delay the game, the better that's going to be for you. Another one of the reasons why, or probably the best reason to run Space Marines out of Coteaz would be for Exterminatus. Coteaz does not have a hard reset, and he suffers the longer the game goes, so he really needs that hard reset.
Right.
The problem is the rest of Space Marines just don't offer enough for him. But if you can stretch the game out, do it. It may mean losing some planets, but if those planets aren't going to lose you the game, that's something to seriously consider. Once your Warlord is bloody, I've got a huge advantage. I may not actually finish the job of assassinating you, but being able to force you to run away as your first action in every fight, even if I don't have Coteaz there because I have a staging ground up and the possibility of a Warbiker dropping in and hitting you for 6 or 8 due to some outposts,
Right.
You have to run away. And if you don't run away, I'm going to win. So you really want to avoid being bloodied by Coteaz. There are many times where I've traded being bloodied with other in non-Coteaz games. I'll bloody your Warlord in exchange for you bloodying mine. You don't want to do that against Coteaz in general, because one, he's hard to bloody. Yes, he loses some hitting power, but he has enough other like, he's not a one-trick pony. He's more than just him. So bloodying him isn't as good as him bloodying you, at which point he's then within one attack of winning the game. So avoid that. There are little things. If you're playing Eldar, let his events go, except for preemptive. Save your nullifies for that. This is sort of a silly advice, but it's very true as well. Get rid of that stupid eagle if you can. If the Coteaz player makes a mistake and leaves the eagle in a position where you can attack him, kill him over any of his other units. Now, if you can kill Coteaz, do that. But how you could kill Coteaz while the Coteaz player has a 3 shield that he can pop up into his hand.
Right.
You've probably already won the game because the Coteaz player's not in a very good spot. But wasting a Tzeentch Firestorm or something like that on the eagle is very much worth it, in my opinion. That's probably my basic advice. There isn't one real trick, but just stretch the game out, keep your Warlord safe, win the planets that you have to, and then it's a fair fight.
Well, you happen to mention, bloodying Torquemada if you can. Granted, it's pretty difficult to do so, but does that, I can only imagine that dramatically, slashes your chances of winning if you no longer have that ability of his to rely on. Does it seem like that's the case? Does it suddenly become just enormously difficult to end up winning?
Yes and no. If you bloody me without me bloodying you, that's big. That hurts. But his stats aren't that bad. He actually gains an attack when he's bloodied.
Right.
So it hurts things where he can't trigger the black ship anymore. And it seems like the only games where Coteaz gets bloodied is when I've already bought the black ship, which really annoys me. But his henchman loses a lot of his synergies, but he still has a lot of tricks up his belt. So he's not dead when he gets bloodied. He's still in a pretty good spot if you're already bloodied. But if he's bloodied and you're not, it's, as with just about everybody, he's not looking good.
Sure. Well, I suppose just before we bring this video to a close, any last pieces of advice or tips, suggestions for Coteaz players, new or, veteran, grizzled, experienced folks out there? Anything else that you feel is worth sharing?
Yeah, it's sort of repeating some of the things I've said, but Coteaz is different. You have to play a lot of games with him to really understand him. He plays the command game differently than all the other warlords, or at least all the other warlords that I can think of. Not having stable cards like promotion takes getting used to. So you have to play games with him. You have to play games against him. Just because you can go through and you can wipe the floor with everybody else doesn't mean you're going to do that with Coteaz. You have to learn his synergies. You have to be able to hide his weaknesses. If you can do that, you're in good shape. But until you can do that, he's going to feel bad. It's hard to explain, but that just innate feeling that you have is going to be that you're losing the game. You may or may not be, but play through it, get used to him, and he's a very fun, very rewarding warlord to play once you've been playing him. When testing, make sure you're testing versus somebody that can also play him well, because playing versus a bad Coteaz deck is a pretty easy thing to do. It's not the power level between a well-piloted Coteaz deck and a poorly piloted Coteaz deck is huge. One other advice is, if you are that new player and you're just picking up the game, put Coteaz down. He's because he plays differently. You're going to see the game from such a warped perspective that it's really going to punish you in the long run. You're not going to understand how other people are playing, why they're doing things, because if you try to mimic those plays, which is a great thing to do when you're learning, those are going to be bad plays for you for a lot of the time.
Sure.
Once you've gone through and you've learned the game, come back, pick them up. But I strongly urge people to not make Coteaz your initial warlord.
Sure. You might as well learn the fundamentals before you try one of the more specialized and unique warlords out there. I suppose really the last thing I wanted to ask you before we, close things down is, do you feel that it's the really high skill ceiling that prevents Coteaz from being more prominently seen in the competitive and tournament scene? Or what is it that holds him back from being widely regarded to be one of those top-tier warlords, in your opinion?
That's tough. I do consider Cody as a top-tier warlord. I consider him on par with Eldrath, with Anshi, probably a little bit of a step below the Space Marines and Kith, but he's a good warlord, but he's not a great warlord.
Okay.
The skill, the play mistakes, the lack of reliability, or the lack of resiliency and ability to come back is something that would make me wary of him to take to a major tournament. I think he's a lot of fun, and he has you can, if he goes out next week and he wins Gen Con, I wouldn't be surprised. I would sort of be surprised that somebody took him that was such a high-level player and sacrificed the resiliency and whatnot.
Right.
But he has the power to go out there. But he also has the power to crash and burn so hard that he's not necessarily the most tournament-friendly player out there.
Maybe the consistency isn't quite at the level of some other warlords.
Yeah, and he only has one speed. One of the great things I like about Conquest, and I got into an argument with some of the semi-local players here, is Conquest is a game where you can be down early and you can come back. It isn't you win planet 1 or you lose command on a bunch of early planets and you're just going to get steamrolled the rest of the way.
Right.
There are very few times where you are out of the game without it being like they're about to attack you for 10 damage and you're already bloodied.
Sure.
At that point, you're probably out of the game regardless, but it's not, the game isn't decided on turn 1. But with Coteaz, he really has to keep pushing that turn 1 button, and that's one of Cato's great strengths, is he can go to an off-planet. Kith can go to an off-planet and den in her chimeras if she has them. Coteaz doesn't have that flexibility. He's going to commit to planet 1 more often than every other warlord out there that I can think of. That is a disadvantage. That's something that it works for him, but it raises the predictability level and is not something that I want to necessarily take to a major tournament. Now, late last night, it turns out I might actually be able to go to Gen Con. And if I do go to Gen Con, I will take Coteaz. But I think that scares off a lot of people, because until you get a lot of experience with him, he feels weak. Whereas the Space Marines and Dark Eldar absolutely do not.
Sure. Well, if you do end up going to the convention, I wish you nothing but the best of luck, and I would absolutely adore if we saw some underestimated somewhat maligned or misunderstood Warlord suddenly, in a sense, come out of nowhere and take the championship. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. So, and plus, it'll make this interview look all the better if you happen to win the tourney or at least place very high. So, I'm counting on you, Paul.
Well, I still think it's probably unlikely that I will be able to go, but it went from 0 to possibly likely.
Well,
So.
best of luck finding room and board and all of that madness.
Oh, that's not a problem. I can drive down there. The problem was I didn't want to spend $60 and a tank and a half of gas to play in one tournament.
Oh, I see.
So.
Well, for me, it's something like 3 flights and $500-$600 worth of plane tickets to go to Gen Con, but I'm not
Yeah, which is
I'm not
also
going to be
not worth
going
it
this
to me.
year. Yeah. But if you do end up going, I hope you have a blast, and I wish you the best of luck. And in any case, thank you very much for coming on and entertaining this interview today. I suppose before we totally bring things to a close, anything else on your mind? Anything you'd like to toss out there?
Yeah, no, I want to thank you for doing all of these interviews and that whole introductory series. I think that's a really great resource that hopefully will allow a lot of more people to come into the game. Conquest is one of my top 3 card games of all time in terms of its playability and style and just good fit. I think it's a excellent game that should continue to grow, but being such a play skill intensive game, even though the card pool is not big, it can be a hard game to break into. And I think the work you've done is a big step towards hopefully getting lowering that access bar. So just want to thank you for that, and hope everybody has a good time at Gen Con, and hopefully Kith or Kato don't walk away with a win. So.
Well, here's hoping. And thank you very much. Thank you sincerely for your compliments there. Just because I know someone's going to ask in the comments, what are the other 2 top-rated Paul Steiner games?
Actually, the last time I went to Gen Con was for a game called Guardians.
Okay.
This was a game in the early to mid 90s. It's really hard to describe. Nobody's heard of it, but I went to Gen Con for their national tournament. It was a 30-some person tournament, and it was a really great time until one of my friends that I had been playtesting with for months on end brought out his surprise deck that was designed solely to beat me.
Oh.
And he did. So he knocked me out in the semifinals, and I've hated him ever since. Not really, but no. Guardians is a great game. And then, actually, I don't know which of these I would rate higher, but Legend of the Five Rings I think is a great game, as is Vampire: The Eternal Struggle. Was a game I really enjoyed. Both of those because they have a real strong multiplayer aspect,
Sure.
which I really enjoy. Multiplayer games where you have to play not only the cards, but balancing off sort of the politics of the group. So
Right.
I highly recommend both those games as well.
Well, fantastic, but I suppose before I ultimately bring things to a complete close, do you want to plug your database one last time? And of course, for anyone watching, I'll be sure to include links in the description so you don't have to memorize the card game DB URL, but where can they find your fantastic database? How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, database is at 40kconquest.blogspot.com. And please just go in there, enter any and every game you play. The more information we have, the better. Right now we've got something like 2,200 games reported. That's only a tiny fraction of the number of Conquest games that have been played.
Sure.
So go through, enter them in. take some time, look at the data. The data really is interesting. I think there's a lot you can learn from it. Like I said, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but as you've said, there's enough games in there now that the basic trends are really shown in there. So
yeah,
go through,
2,000 is a fair
it.
few. So, all right.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose thank you once again, Paul, for coming on. I very much appreciate your time in this extended interview, so thank you once again, and best of luck to you if you do end up going to Gen Con. So I'm sure you'll keep us posted, and we'll all be paying rapt attention to the results of the tournament for sure.
Cool, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, with our interview having ultimately come to a close, I'll just finish this video by saying thank you once again for watching. Be sure to leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, opinions, perspective, and experience when it comes to Kotz and the Astra Militarum faction as a whole. Interaction with viewers such as yourself is the absolute highlight of creating and maintaining content for this channel, so please take a moment to let me know what you thought of this interview and which warlord you'd like to see next. If it just so happens that you know someone that might make a good interview candidate for a future video, by all means feel free to share. But with that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you have not done so already. Please feel free to contact me directly and keep in touch through all the social media if you'd like. But in any case, thank you once again for watching, and as ever, be sure to check back again soon for ever more Conquest content to come.